And I was just anxious to sort of walk into this famous Center for the Study of Philosophy of Science, because it had John Dewey was there at some point in time, and other famous philosophers had been there. And when I got there, hi, I'm Dr. Tom Denning, better known to my students as Dr. D.
And I'm Kate.
Kate and I are a pair of misfits just trying to find our way in the world. The fact that I became an entrepreneur and professor,
And the fact that I'm trying to find where I fit into education is because we don't fit in anywhere else.
what makes us unique is that we embrace our status as misfits. We don't expect the world to change to meet our nerdy, quirky personalities, and we're not going to change ourselves. We think misfits should be comfortable with and honor their unique perspectives and the positive things they bring to the world. In this episode, we're exploring how the study of philosophy can benefit misfits and can help others join the misfit team. We call this episode The Ambitious Philosopher.
All right. So the ambitious philosopher, what the hell does that mean, Tom?
Well, I guess it means that I always knew I was kind of nerdy. And yet at the same time, I didn't want to just accept, what it is that nerdy people sometimes have to live with. I mean, sometimes we just don't fit in. So what kind of a job category are we going to fit into? And I knew I couldn't fit into any particular job category. So just studying philosophy at all says that there's something about you that is not, part of the mainstream, right? And yet at the same time, I wanted to be in the mainstream. I wanted to have the nice things that people that are, that fit in. I wanted to have the same things that they have. So I actually, when I finished my undergraduate program at the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point, I decided that I wanted to study philosophy in graduate school. And that's not something many people do, right? And so when I went off to study philosophy at the University of Minnesota this is way back in 1983, Kate, can you imagine, right? I mean, this is ancient history now. But I had a child and a wife, and we moved into student housing there at the University of Minnesota. And I'll tell you right now, I wasn't a very good student as an undergraduate. But I got accepted into graduate school because I could perform pretty well on those entry exams. But I began studying philosophy, and I actually had had a few courses in philosophy when I was an undergrad as well. My major in as an undergrad was in the sciences, and I had a minor in biology. So I got all this weird stuff right in the background. And I just was attracted to the study of philosophy. Why is that, right? And I'll dig into that in a minute, but I want to just kind of stay on the theme of the ambitious philosopher, because in our last episode, we talked about entrepreneurship, right?
We did, but you were the reluctant entrepreneur in that episode, and now
Very
you're the ambitious
reluctant entrepreneur.
philosopher.
But what forces you to be an entrepreneur is that you just don't fit in anywhere else. So one of the things that you'll find if you go to grad school is that you run out of money real fast, and you need money, and you need some way to support yourself. And the university was not yet providing me because, as I mentioned, I had a very bad score as an undergrad, so they weren't going to give me a scholarship. That wasn't going to happen. I had to find my own way. So, as this nerdy kind of philosopher, here I am faced with the reality that I also couldn't perform any kind of particular business function. I didn't know accounting, I didn't know finance, I didn't know even management or any of these kinds of things. So I had to become an entrepreneur, right? If you don't fit in somewhere, you got to create the structure yourself. And so, as we talked about in episode 1, I started that business in 1984 that was focused on the electric utility industry, and we were able to, I was able to support myself. And I kind of caught the bug then, if you will, of being an entrepreneur philosopher, which was kind of fun. And it gave me the stability that I needed. And it was the kind of thing, because it was just two of us basically working in the shop and creating, some income for ourselves, that I had enough time to study and do the other kinds of things and work my way through philosophy. So I think it's possible, right, to wed two things together that don't seem to be a very good fit. And so maybe ambition and philosophy do seem to be also misfit kind of a category, right? That you can be entrepreneurial and philosophical all at the same time. Can you imagine that? How odd that is, that you are able to study this very esoteric area of human, human discourse, human discussion, and still find a way to become an entrepreneur and make, a decent living. In fact, I was making more money than even my professors. And that was kind of something that I learned later on, but it was like, I just kept doing stuff, right?
So you've been involved in a lot of business schools over time. Is philosophy something they teach new entrepreneurs?
I'm not going to, some people say that philosophy is a great grounding for whatever profession you want to go into because it teaches you critical thinking, or it teaches you, how to be analytic or something like that. I think I already had those qualities before I became a philosopher. And I think part of the reason I became a philosopher was to exercise those capacities. I have a very kind of analytic mind, which is nerdy, of course, and I tend to overthink everything, right? And so philosophy kind of was, if you will, kind of therapeutic. It gave an outlet for that restless mind that I have, and it, so I just, took a bunch of courses, obviously, and it was funny because, when I walked into the first classroom at the University of Minnesota, I had no idea what to expect, right? I mean, it's like, what kind of really bright and intelligent philosophers are going to be here? And I'll tell you what, these kids, they were smart. Oh my God. I mean, it was a logic course, right? And logic is probably my least interesting topic in philosophy. And I would never urge anyone to study formal logic. I think it's neat, but it doesn't really help in anything that you try to do. And it's not something that you're going to translate into some other kind of calling, if you will. But the other courses that I started to take, I had a course my very first semester on John Locke and his perspective on psychology. And, one of the things that I was very interested in addition to the natural sciences, was human psychology. In fact, it was corresponding with B.F. Skinner when I was an undergrad, who was a famous behaviorist, right? And so when I got exposed to John Locke, I said, oh, okay. So these guys study a lot of the things that I think about that are in my head, but I never found anybody else that wants to talk about this stuff. It's like, what are we? Who are we? And how do we know that the ideas that we have are, tethered in some way to reality? And because there's so much disharmony in the world, right? And I'm very sensitive to that for some reason. I don't know why. Different religions and different perspectives in the sciences and everything. It's like, how do you adjudicate that? How do you find a way to sort of make sure that that what you believe, in fact, is the right belief, right? And John Locke began that exploration of that. For me, it began that exploration of that particular nerdy way of looking at the world.
So when we talk about philosophy, what subject matters are you covering in that
Yeah,
kind of realm?
it's pretty bizarre, isn't it? I mean,
Mhm.
it's very wide ranging. And so what is philosophy, right? And of course, people will give you different definitions of that. And for me, it was more or less epistemology, right? And epistemology, it's kind of a tongue twister, but it basically means the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And it just seemed to me like that was something very important. As I mentioned, I was in the sciences and studied the sciences. And and even in the sciences, you have different theories in the same area of study, and you have quite a have scientists fighting it out and dogfighting over which perspective should be awarded more money from the federal government in the terms of grants and things, right? So it goes on and on. So I thought, oh, well, if I study philosophy and if I study epistemology, I'll be able to help settle these disputes. And so there actually is a sort of a subset of epistemology called philosophy of science. And that's kind of where I specialized, right? Because I was in the sciences and was interested in understanding how scientific method and all that kind of stuff. And it turned out that the University of Minnesota, where I was studying my master's degree in philosophy, it has a famous Center for the Study of Philosophy of
Mm.
Science, right? And I got to tell you, this is the funniest damn thing, right? So, I mean, back in those days, I mean, Kate, I don't know if you were even born yet, but in 1982, 1981, I was making application for graduate school. And this is, before the internet. So I literally, to this day, I cannot even remember how it was that I discovered that the University of Minnesota was the sort of the Center for the Study of Philosophy of Science. I don't remember how I came upon that. And then I don't even remember how it is I learned how to do the application process. It must have been some office at the university that I worked in, because there was no internet, there was no, calling people, there was none of that. So anyway, I got in, and I was just anxious to sort of walk into this famous Center for the Study of Philosophy of Science, because it had John Dewey was there at some point in time, and other famous philosophers had been there. And when I got there, it's in Ford Hall at the University of Minnesota. It was little more than a broom closet with a bunch of books and papers, and not even staffed by anybody. And it was kind of like, oh, okay, I guess that's what philosophy is all about, right? Is that we're just not going to be able to even afford to put this into an office somewhere, or have, some kind of a, honored space for the Center for Philosophy of Science. So it was a funny, realization of what it was to be a philosopher. I kind of knew, that, you think about a philosopher, what comes to mind when you think of a philosopher?
Descartes and the Shadow of the Caves, and just
Yeah,
some of
right.
the more well-known ones.
Sandals and robes, right? And maybe begging on the street corner, right? So I wanted to study this stuff, but I still had the ambition to take care of my family and to enjoy all the fruits of Western economy. And I just had to find a way to fit my nerdy quest to understand with opportunities that came my way. And so philosophy can be a lot of different things. And I think most of all, it is sort of the most general way for us to try to put into words what human life is about. And of course, that changes with differing technologies. It changes with differing cultures. It changes with the evolution of our species and so on. But we need, in every culture, we need somebody that tries to put into words what is the meaning of our lives. And every one of us needs that. Every one of us has a grounding of some sort that gets us through these difficult days. And whether, some people turn to a religion where that's kind of ready made for you, and there's creeds and other kinds of things that you can subscribe to. But for those who are a little more questing, a little more curious, and who don't understand why I choose one religion over another, or, I can't necessarily just fit into the religion I was born into, we have to have some other source that we can turn to for that quest. And I think we all, as sentient beings, we have to have some type of a grounding other than, just the motives and the impulses that drive us every day. We have to have something that keeps us from, eating that extra candy bar at the end of the night because we want to so badly. That's our impulse, but something has to tell us, no, that's not good for you, right? So that's philosophy.
Do you think that most people are blind or unaware of the philosophers and the new concepts of this day and age? Does everyone just look to the past, or are people tuned in to new ideas that emerge?
Yeah. So I think most of us, when I asked you, what's your impression of philosopher, right? Descartes, Plato, the shadows on the cave, and that kind of thing. So we have this kind of perspective. And I think most people look at philosophy pretty much the way they look at, at salespeople. I mean, they just don't want to be that, right? And so they don't see the relevance of it. And I think partially it's because philosophy has lost track of its own way. So when you look at academic philosophy today, I probably couldn't name to you a single academic philosopher that's alive today. I really couldn't. And because a lot of their work is kind of uh, kind of focused on trying to clarify what scientists are doing. So they work a lot with scientific information, and they try to kind of clarify concepts within that domain, which makes them fairly useful to scientists and other technicians, but not so much to the average person on the street. So what we've lost, I think, in philosophy is the poetry part of it, right? So we've tried to get technical, and we want to be like, we have physics envy, if you will, right? Physics envy is sort of common in the humanities. It's like, how do we make the humanities as rigorous and as the sciences? And we don't need that. We don't want that. We want the humanities and philosophy and the liberal arts generally to be the poetry in our lives, right? And changing our perspectives by changing the words we use to describe how it is that we're living. And I think that's where philosophy has kind of lost its way. And we don't have anybody that's writing in a manner that brings all those pieces together. I think the last really strong writers that we could point to that were trying to do that were the existentialists that came out of World War II in France, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone Beauvoir and others that were writing in that genre, the existential genre, which I love to read, by the way. They were trying to make sense of life in the insanity, of 2 consecutive world wars where millions and millions of people lost their lives. How do you make sense of that? And existentialism was a direct response to that. And it was written, there's technical stuff, sure, but it also was, what is the meaning of all this, right? So it's unfortunate, but everything comes around, and I think there's going to be a great writer that'll come along again that will recapture the ability to philosophize. Maybe here in America, the last great philosopher might have been that was sort of in the public eye was John Dewey. Before that, Henry David Thoreau and Emerson. But John Dewey, was a great 20th century writer who really ranged over politics, education, and economics and everything else. And in fact, has a book on, the meaning of life. So we don't have anybody writing in that genre today. Why? Because you can't make a lot of money doing that, right? I mean, unless you kind of tweaked it into some kind of self-helpy kind of a thing, right? Then it might sell. So economics forces us to do the best we can with what we are. My master's thesis, because as I mentioned, my business at the time was to the issue of whether or not there were human health effects from electric and magnetic fields from high voltage power lines, and we were providing the electric utility industry with a lot of data and information on this. And one of the things that I got to participate in was court hearings. There were a lot of court hearings, and the issue always came up. And the court hearings were, usually the parents against the electric utility industry. And the parents said, "Don't route that power line here because it's gonna affect our children." And so the court, the defense attorneys from the electric utility industry, they'd bring in these scientists, and the scientists would say, "Well, the science says there's no problem here." And the parents would bring in a scientist, and their scientists would say, "Well, we think there might be a problem," right? So you know what? They can't decide. And so I studied that. The COVID vaccine and other things are manifestation of this sort of state science connection. We separated church and state, but now science and state have come together to sort of hold people down and kind of dictate how it is that we need to behave. It's not settled in some kind of way that we need to change everything that we're doing in our lives, right? And human freedom. And if I don't care what the science says, and I want to get my power from a coal-fired power plant, why shouldn't I be allowed to do that, right? And so it's not simply the case that we need to just capitulate to science in either the vaccine situation or the climate change situation or the abortion situation, whatever it might be. That in fact, this is a human debate. And it's not simply about, what the science is telling, because the science is going to change anyway. And, how many times have people told us that, oh my God, we got 20 years left before the climate is going to be so bad. And here we are 20 years later. And it's like, well, it's maybe a little warmer, but I'm okay. So, right. So if they say, look, I found, it's like, remember years ago, there was a book that came out and it was about, The Secret was the name of the book. And it was like, if you, sort of tune into this kind of element of the universe, right? That's the secret. And you're going to get everything you want in life. And it's anybody that is proclaiming that they have something other than a poetic new way of engaging the world, then drop it. If they're telling you that in fact they've found something and they've got a Rosetta Stone or whatever the hell, and they have a pipeline to absolute truth, leave that behind, because that's not going to help you.
So thank you, Dr. D. That was really illuminating. I learned a lot. What will we be talking about next?
Well, next week, I really want to delve into the Austrian School of Economics. I think it's time for us to re-understand the Austrian school. It's tied in part to the Chicago School of Economics. But I want to begin next week with talking about some of my favorite writings from the Austrian school, beginning with The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, which I think should be read by every single undergraduate student in America. And I think it should be read by every adult who wants to understand a little bit about how it is that we can, through good intentions, in fact, reduce the freedoms that we've so much enjoyed in the Western world. So stay tuned for that. And I can't wait to talk about that next time.